Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 38 for Sunday the 9th of September 2018, and this week our subject is The Post, the 2017 Steven Spielberg directed movie, hello again Mr. Spielberg, detailing the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 by the Washington Post and the New York Times. Starring Meryl Streep as Katherine Graham, proprietor and publisher of the Post, and Tom Hanks as Ben Bradlee, the executive editor. My name is Martin Darlington, and with me as ever is Andrew Blischik.
Hello, Martin.
Hello.
We've got some news. Those of you that visit the website, www.historybyhollywood.com, will notice that the format of the episodes page has changed after the last episode. We hope it's working okay and would welcome any thoughts or feedback. You can write to us at hosts@historybyhollywood.com or via the Facebook page, facebook.com/historybyhollywood, all one word, or on Twitter where the address is @historybyhwood. First up then, let's get on with some reviews. We've got two and they're both five-star reviews, so thank you very much. The Belly Jar in the US wrote, a wonderful podcast about where actual history and the glamour of Hollywood intersect. The hosts do a great job of thoroughly researching their subjects, while injecting a bit of their own personal feelings. I was slightly afraid that knowing the real stories behind my favourite films might ruin the illusion, but it has actually enhanced my enjoyment of the subject matter. Thanks for the great show, guys. And thanks to you, the marvellously named Belly Jar.
Yeah, that's a good point actually. The thing of maybe you don't want to know the truth behind the movies you love, but obviously it hasn't detracted from Belly Jar's enjoyment, so it's greatly appreciated. Do
you think that most of our fans are skewing more history or more Hollywood? I think it's more history, like you and I would be, I guess.
Yeah.
So
watch movie. There may be some movie enthusiasts who are like, it'd be interesting to know how much of it's true. But I think primarily, we're getting the history fans who also like movies.
Yeah, that's good.
We also had a review by a friend of the show, Ben Robertson, who Ben's American but living in Canada. He wrote, it's unfortunate that I only recently discovered History by Hollywood because I now have to work my way through 36 episodes just to catch up. Martin and Andrew do a marvellous job of dissecting movies with a more or less historical basis to determine just how accurate they are with regard to history. Their style is engaging, making it seem more like a conversation between friends that is nevertheless erudite and entertaining. The downside is that it makes me want to go back and watch many of these movies over again. Not in itself a bad thing, but it means less time available to watch newer movies or to listen to podcasts. Look forward to many more episodes. Keep up the great work, guys. Ben, thank you so much. That's really kind, and I think we're starting to live with our slight discomfort reading out praise to ourselves. Bit of self-backslapping never went amiss, I suppose. But thank you, Ben, and thank you, Belly Jar. If anybody does find the time to click on the star rating on whichever platform you hear us, or even better, write a few lines, it is great for raising the podcast profile. And last month we broke all records as far as iTunes downloads, which is still quite limited information, but they are providing podcasters with some feedback, and of course the website as well. So we're modestly growing,
moving in the right direction. So more on listener feedback. We've had emails from Ben Robertson, and as well as his rather lovely review, he had written to the Halifax, Nova Scotia Chronicle Herald on the death of Auschwitz survivor Philip Reitman. Philip had been active supporting local schools and colleges in education about the Holocaust, and the subject of denial arose. Ben's last paragraph is worth sharing. Quote, yet it is surprisingly easy to refute. One does not have to spend hours poring over historical records and amassing mountains of evidence. It comes down to one simple fact. The Nazi officials, tried for war criminals at Nuremberg, tried to defend their actions as, quote, just following orders, unquote, but not a single one of them ever denied that the Holocaust took place. Not one. Case closed.
So again, Ben is becoming, very much a close friend of the show and a great supporter. Very interesting point he makes there, which I hadn't really thought about.
No, but when someone makes it to you, it's obvious, isn't it?
It's like, well, if there was any doubt that it had happened, that would have been their first line of defence, going, it didn't happen, prove it.
Yeah, great point.
Because the proof is there if you search for it. And this was in response to a post on our Facebook page. I had one response from a lady who said, she just put fiction ? And I said, and she was questioning why Thomas Keneally's original book was listed as fiction. And we had a very rational, balanced discussion about it. And, and she wasn't in any way a Holocaust denier or anything like that. Then I got a message from one Seamus O'Hare, spelt the Irish way, on the Schindler's List thread, and it simply read Jewish lies. So I challenged him to expand and justify the statement. And I did, I suppose, slightly inflammatory. I said, or slightly combatively, I said, if you're a Holocaust denier, you're either a liar, as I said in the show, or you're too stupid to question other people's lies. So when I challenged him to expand and justify the statement, his reply was, in that very clear Anglo-Saxon, F you. But sadly, I don't think he was just a troll. You get these people who
contradict anything you say.
Yeah, they question whether they exist unless people are reacting to them. The best way to get people to react is say outrageous things. Because he then sent me a private message, this buffoon Seamus O'Hare, saying some may have died in work camps, but there were no gas chambers or ovens. Do your research. At that point, I called him a muppet, and for the first time ever on social media, I blocked someone.
Good for you.
Because I thought, I don't really. He's contributing absolutely nothing to the debate. So, goodbye, Seamus O'Hare, and I hope you have a miserable life.
Further listener feedback. Philip Pomerantz, hello Philip, our in-house medical consultant, also wrote in along with Nick Parkinson, who has been had a marathon catch-up of our episodes and had some great comments about some of the earlier eps, plus some great links to more information that we're currently trying to find the time to explore. Also, welcome to David Amble, a new listener who discovered us through the History of England podcast, and we weren't even aware that they'd given us a plug, but if anyone did hear this, please could you point us to the episode in question so we can thank them. David had some great points about the Dunkirk episode, where he proposed that the Spitfire gliding endurance may well have appeared to be lengthened because of Christopher Nolan's timeline gymnastics. You'll recall that there was a very confusing jump around in time with many scenes being repeated from different angles.
David points out he's quite used to Christopher Nolan. He's quite a fan of his, and he's quite used to that timeline thing. But he said watching it, his wife was getting really frustrated, saying, what is going on? How are we back here and there? And
it's a good point that he raises, I guess. We might have been we didn't allow for that in your comments. I got frustrated with it, so now I feel slightly stupid that I didn't understand it straight Maybe. David continues, he suggested Gettysburg as a future subject movie, and it's on the long list for sure. Now, Gettysburg, when was that?
90s, was it?
Right.
It's a 3-4 hour film, I think, so we have to try and make sure it didn't become a 3 or 4 hour episode.
One of our subplots that themes that we keep returning to is the Civil War. We've had 3? Two at least.
We've done Selma, which is the emancipation and civil and the result of, and I think Gloria linked in so well with that because you had Private Trip, the Denzel Washington character, saying to the Colonel, even if we win, nothing will change.
And then we did
Lincoln, of course.
Yeah.
And then we are looking then 100 years later when they're still trying to get an effective vote, That's when I say they, I mean, the black populations, particularly in the southern states.
So it's definitely on the list. That's a short story.
Yeah. Now, the next episode will be without Andrew, as he's away for a couple of weeks on yet another holiday.
No, this is work.
This is work, sorry. So I'll be trying to keep the house in order, and we'll be covering Darkest Hour, the recent movie starring Gary Oldman and Winston Churchill in the very early days of his premiership in 1940. And we are hoping to be joined by guest hosts, more of which later. Information about upcoming episodes can be found at historybyhollywood.com/planned-episodes.
Well done. So it's on with this week's movie, The Post. And as always, let's start with the story of the movie. The Post is a 2017 political thriller set in 1971 and directed by our old friend Steven Spielberg. It stars Meryl Streep, as Katherine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post at the time, as well as Tom Hanks as Ben Bradlee, the Post's then editor, and Matthew Rhys as Daniel Ellsberg, the leaker of the infamous Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers was a full-blown scandal for the Nixon administration, and the events surrounding their leaking has been somewhat eclipsed by the later and greater Watergate scandal, which would commence with the break-in at the Watergate Hotel a year after the action portrayed in the Post. The Pentagon Papers blew the whistle on the US government's false portrayal of their claimed successes in the war in Vietnam. The Post was written by veteran screenwriters Liz Hanna and Josh Singer, and while it doesn't seem to have been based directly on any one book, it would have been heavily influenced by Daniel Ellsberg's own 2002 book, Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, and Katherine Graham's own 1998 memorial, Personal History.
It was filmed principally in New York City and premiered on December the 14th, 2017 at the Newseum in Washington, D.C. It cost $50 million to make, took $177 million at the box office, so a clear financial success. And it was also a critical success with an 87% positive score on Rotten Tomatoes. It was nominated for a whole pile of awards, but only won a handful of lesser awards. And it was only nominated for 2 Oscars, Best Picture and Best Actress for Streep, but was unsuccessful in both categories. And what's surprising is this was the first time that Spielberg worked with Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks. In fact, Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks had never been on a movie together before. Yeah. And although they've both been directed by Steven Spielberg, never together. So 3 real A-list, heavy hitters. That year the Best Picture went to The Shape of Water. It's not a movie I've seen.
No, it's a very niche art house film.
Right, and Best Actress went to Frances McDormand in 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, which I wish was a true story, then we could cover it. Have you seen it?
No, I've not.
Oh,
it's pretty
fantastic.
Grim, though.
It is. It's grim, but it's very, very gritty, real. But anyway, that is the story of the movie. So the movie synopsis and reality check. The opening scene sees us in Hao Nia province, I hope that's pronounced, in Vietnam in 1966, with an American Army patrol preparing to set out. We see a slightly older, longer-haired man in army fatigues. He's handed a rifle, and one of the regular soldiers asks his mate, "Who's the long hair?" And he said, "Oh, that's Ellsberg. He works with Langsdale at the embassy." And this is Daniel Ellsberg, played by Matthew Rhys. We see the patrol moving quietly in the night when they're ambushed and a firefight ensues in which both American and Vietnamese are hit. Next we see the same Daniel Ellsberg still in the field writing up a report. Then we cut to an airliner where he is asked to give his verbal report to Robert McNamara, who was then Secretary of Defense, played by Bruce Greenwood, and a Mr. Comer, who we are told is working with the President on Vietnam. By this stage, that President would have been Lyndon B. Johnson. McNamara is telling Comer that he may say things are better, but McNamara's feeling is that they're worse. Asked for his opinion, Ellsberg says the thing that struck him is they're actually pretty much the same as before. And then McNamara points out that this is after the addition of an extra 100,000 US troops, leading him to his negative conclusion.
Then we see the aircraft arriving back in the US. Journalists are there to meet McNamara, and they ask him of his impressions of Vietnam. So while he's talking to the press, Daniel Ellsberg walks away in the background and he hears the Secretary of State,
Secretary of
Defence, tell a pack of lies about optimism and improvements that's going on completely against his earlier assertions on the aircraft. Shall we set the scene?
Let's set the scene. Daniel Ellsberg was a child prodigy genius. Strange kid apparently. Well, I say strange. He wasn't really into, rough and tumble games and all that. But then he did join the US Marine Corps in the 50s. He was a rifle platoon commander and at times acted as a company commander. And in 1959 went to work for the RAND Corporation, a non-profit military strategy think tank, which became very, very influential. He was employed as a military analyst. In 1964, he was seconded to the Department of Defense. And in this role, he served in Vietnam from 65 to 67, which did include tours of frontline units to assess the progress being made by the US military efforts.
So that's a very strong start, isn't it? I mean, Daniel Ellsberg's the real character. He did go to Vietnam. He did work for this advisory company, the RAND Corporation. Robert McNamara is the other interesting character at this point in time. He's seen at the time as one of the leading hawks in pushing the US involvement in Vietnam. It became clear to him later in his life that he doubted the chances of a US success at all in Vietnam and argued against any continued involvement. His political loyalties meant that these views weren't aired until much, much later. I think he was actually appointed Secretary of Defence under Kennedy.
Yes, he was, yeah.
So he'd seen at least two presidents getting stuck into this protracted war that seemed to be going badly for them, but
yeah.
they were telling the public otherwise.
And clearly a very intelligent and driven man. Early in his life, he became the first president of the Ford Motor Company who wasn't a member of the Ford family. Then he became Secretary of Defence for JFK and continued that role with LBJ's administration. Now, I haven't watched it all yet, but there was a very, very well-received 2003 documentary movie called The Fog of War by director Errol Morris, and it shows numerous candid interviews with McNamara, which sounds a bit dull, but apparently it's not. The way he uses graphics and charts and graphs and newsreel clips, it's actually really gripping, supposedly, and it's based on a number of candid interviews with McNamara. And the movie scores 97 and 93 respectively on Rotten Tomatoes from critics and audiences. It won an Academy Award for Best Documentary, and it could be worth a watch for those interesting. And there's also a paperback based on the same interviews, links to both of which we'll put in the show notes for this episode.
And I think McNamara went on to become head of the World Bank later on, because I can remember in the late 80s when I was backpacking in Africa with my girlfriend, whose name was McNamara.
Right.
Got all sorts of comments of whether she was related to this McNamara. Of course she wasn't. Okay, so back to the movie. We see Ellsberg in an office. He's opening files and looking around to ensure that he's unobserved. He's clearly up to something. He passes some security guards on the way to the building. He looks nervous, and we next see him in a car with another man and a woman. They drive to some offices somewhere else, where Ellsberg starts to make copies of the documents that he took earlier. It's a report of American involvement in Vietnam prepared for the Secretary of Defence. We see some archive footage of President Truman in the 50s, then Eisenhower, then Kennedy, and finally Johnson. Ellsberg's friends are cutting off the tops and bottoms of each sheet, removing the top secret labels.
I mean, the only bit of reality there is interesting is you listen to Daniel Ellsberg talk about it. Actually, his 10-year-old daughter helped him, and she cheerfully was slicing off these top secret caveats at the top and bottom of each page, and they decided not to include that in the movie because it seemed a bit too far-fetched. But actually,
would have been lovely.
Yeah,
would have been a nice touch.
True. Okay, so back to the movie, and we meet Katherine, or frequently referred to in the movie as Kay Graham, played by Meryl Streep. She wakes, and then we see her in her office talking to advisor Fritz Beebe, played by Tracy Letts, and they're planning to float the Washington Post on the stock market. Kay Graham is the owner of the Post, and she's torn between wanting to maintain the paper's integrity but also needing to make it financially viable. She then takes a phone call from the White House Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman, who tells Kay that they have a bit of a problem. Next, we see her arriving at a restaurant to meet Ben Bradlee, played by Tom Hanks, her executive editor. She has a suitcase with her, and when he asks why, she reminds him that they're meeting the bankers later that day. They discuss a New York Times reporter called Neil Sheehan, who'd been writing a lot about Vietnam, and they're both clearly admirers, but Bradlee says the guy hasn't written a piece in 3 months, which to me I'd think, oh, so what, he's hasn't got any new information. But their antennae are obviously twitching. When a prolific reporter who specialises in a subject suddenly goes quiet, she says, do you think he's got something big? And he went, yeah. He said, and I saw Abe, which is I can't remember his surname, but Rosenbach. He's the one of the senior guys at New York Times. Bradlee says he saw him at a party looking mighty smug, and they both laugh and say, well, he always looks smug.
She then tells Ben about the call she got from the White House, Haldeman at the White House, and we learn that their White House reporters, the Post's White House reporter, Judy, is being barred from attending President Nixon's daughter's wedding due to some critical pieces that she had written in the Post. Kay Graham is understanding about the President's reaction, though Ben Bradlee is less forgiving. They have a back and forth about whether to send a different reporter, and we see Ben acknowledge that Kay is his boss and the publisher, but he also lays down a clear line that he holds editorial responsibility and makes such decisions. Kay fairly graciously concurs. Despite clear disagreements, they're obviously an effective team and get along well.
Yeah. Okay, in reality, background to the Washington Post, it was bought from a bankruptcy court in 1933 by Eugene Mayer. That was the father of Kay Graham, When Eugene died, he passed ownership to Kay's husband, Phil Graham. When Phil Graham died in 1963, he'd struggled with alcoholism and depression. Then he had an affair, and then he took his own life with a shotgun, which is sort of fleetingly referred to. She does mention in the movie that it's suicide, not accident, as people say. But ownership passed to Kay Graham, making her the first female publisher of a prominent American newspaper. Ben Bradlee had been the editor of Newsweek, a magazine owned by the Washington Post company, when Kay Graham promoted him to chief editor or executive editor of the Post. The appointment did cause some surprise in journalist circles, but under Bradley's leadership, the Post, which at that time was seen to be very much in the shadow of the New York Times, started to raise its profile.
The piece about the clash with Nixon over the daughter's wedding, and barring the Post sending any reporters, it is reported in Kay Graham's memoirs. But the Nixon administration didn't start the wholesale ban of reporters and certainly newspapers from attending the White House until a couple of years later in the midst of the Watergate affair, and which started a year after the events portrayed here. Nixon's portrayal in the movie is probably one of the less accurate aspects. While he was clearly a confrontational president when he felt challenged, he wouldn't really get nasty until he was being personally challenged over the Watergate scandal. Here is a scratchy recording of Nixon banning the Post, but this occurred over a year after the Pentagon Papers event.
I want it clearly understood that from now on, ever, no reporter from the Washington Post is ever to be in the White House. Is that clear?
Absolutely.
Unless it's a press conference.
Yes, sir.
Now,
the briefings here, but
on a briefing. But never in the White House, no church service, nothing that Mrs. Nixon does. You tell Connie, don't tell Mrs. Nixon because she'll approve it. No reporter from the Washington Post is ever to be in the White House again, and no photographer either. Mm-hmm. No photographer. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
None ever to be in. Now that is a total order, and if necessary, I'll fire you. You understand?
I do understand.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
So, despite the fact that a number of critics have said, it's a bit of a harsh view of Nixon, he's portrayed as a bit of a villain, and of course he's not implicated in the Pentagon Papers report because he became president after that report had been completed, and it really documented how his predecessors from the Democratic Party had lied to the American people. You know, the cult hero JFK had lied through his back teeth, as had Lyndon Johnson.
And initially Nixon was pretty sanguine about it. He said, well, good, if it comes out and that my predecessors did a bad job and I've only recently gotten the big job, he didn't mind that this leaking was going on initially, did he?
No, it was Kissinger, I believe, who said, look, this is really going to damage us with foreign affairs, obviously Kissinger being a foreign affairs expert. But that clip we just heard, he says to the guy at the end, basically, so no Washington Post report is ever going to come in. All right, this is not about the Pentagon Papers, that was about Watergate. And then he says, if necessary, I'll fire you.
You understand?
He does sound nasty.
Well, he was a nasty individual. But,
yeah, but I think all senior politicians probably have to be.
Oh, he was particularly nasty. His reputation is particularly nasty.
But how much of that is because we look back now with the hindsight of the Watergate and what he definitely authorised, even if he didn't specifically order it?
I mean, the infamous tapes that he kept, the paranoid recording of every conversation in the White House.
Oh, yeah.
He was foul-mouthed, anti-Semitic, racist. Maybe they all were. I don't know. It's just Nixon had the tapes, but he definitely has a deservedly bad reputation for being a nasty piece of work.
Okay, back to the movie. We see a young man arriving at a door and holding up his ID. He's handed a folder and told to run to the New York Times and deliver the folder, which is marked Project X, and to say it's from Sheehan. He hands it through a door to a man when he arrives, and this man passes it to his boss. We then cut to the Washington Post office. Ben Bradlee is arriving at work, being briefed on various ongoing stories. Gathering team in his office, Ben asks whether anyone saw Neil Sheehan at the White House press conference. They all reply no, and just as Ben and Kay earlier, their antennas twitch and they obviously speculate that Sheehan's onto something or up to something. We then meet Ben Bradlee, played by Bob Odenkirk, a senior reporter who offers, in fact he was one of the department editors, I believe. He offers to go digging, and Ben Bradlee says, no, that's below your pay grade. So he calls an intern over, gives him $40, says, take a train to New York, go to the Times office, don't tell them who you work for, but find a reporter called Neil Sheehan. So.
The reality. Neil Sheehan, he was a veteran reporter of the New York Times, and he received some copies of the Pentagon Papers, as they would then become to be known, from our Daniel Ellsberg, after Ellsberg failed to find a senator willing to read them and take them up in politics. Ellsberg was well aware that he could and probably would go to jail for revealing the papers. Ben Bradlee is very much as portrayed in the movie, an experienced reporter who was deeply passionate about his duty to report without political or financial favour. Not long after the period in this story, he would spend some days in a US prison, masquerading as a murderer to report on conditions in the prison. He wrote a book, The Media Monopoly, in 1983, warning about the growing trend of media outlets being concentrated in the hands of a few large conglomerates. In 2004, some 20 years later, he updated the book, calling the new version The New Media Monopoly, and noting that the 50 large media corporations he had listed in the first volume had now become 5.
That's shocking,
isn't it? And probably further consolidated since.
We will put a link in the show notes for this episode to Ben's book, The New Media Monopoly, as well. He's a lovely character. I just like watching him. He's very engaging in the film.
And the casting is interesting because one of the other lead reporters in the role of Post is David Cross, and Bob Odenkirk and David Cross are legendary comic legends. They had this off-the-wall show on HBO called The Mr. Man Show, I think.
Right.
Completely surreal. And then Bob Odenkirk got a role as the lawyer Saul in Breaking Bad.
Saul.
And Breaking Bad, the
Breaking
prequel.
Bad,
and that changed the mould. And to see them both in these serious, well-portrayed roles is a real treat.
Comedians often seem to be very good actors. Maybe that sort of just goes with being a stand-up comedian. I'm
Maybe.
not sure.
You've got to be pretty brave.
Back to the movie, and we've got Kay Graham arriving at a meeting, and she's the only woman amongst a group of suited men, many of them older. Cutting back to Bradley's office, they're discussing how to cover Nixon's daughter's wedding whilst their own reporter is banned. Ben Bradlee suggests they call other papers and see if they'll all boycott the wedding to protect the right to publish and show some solidarity. I think quite a few of the other reporters, a bit of his staff, are a bit dubious about whether that will work. Back at the financial meeting, we're told that the share price has been lowered, costing the paper $3 million, or in equivalent 25 reporters. And we see Kay Graham get a bit flummoxed here. She has quite a lot of notes for a speech she's going to give about ensuring quality and, in turn, quality driving profitability, but she kind of freezes and is unable to say the words. And her close advisor, Fritz Beebe, who is a lawyer by trade, he sat next to her, and obviously aware of the speech's content, he launches into it on her behalf.
I think we saw her a bit earlier on rehearsing these.
That's right,
so she's in control, she's got the brief down pat, but this scene says that when she actually came to deliver it, she freezes and one of the men take over for her. So I think they're setting us up to think she's a newbie, she's not as confident as she could be. They're portraying her in the movie, so we can discuss how correctly they got that. As they leave the meeting, Kay's group are downbeat. She tries to rally them, saying bankers lower prices all the time. But one of her entourage, Arthur Parsons, played by the wonderful Bradley Whitford, says that the banks are probably skittish about a woman being in charge. We then see Kay go into her private office, but can hear the men in her group talking out in the lobby, and Arthur Parsons is saying that she throws a great party, but that her father left the paper to her husband. We realise around this time that her husband has died, and there is a mention of Phil's accident. Parsons also mocks the idea that the Post is on the same league as the New York Times. Then Kay joins them and smiles sweetly when Parsons says it's her decision, and thanks him for his frankness. Parsons is trying to persuade her to offer more family shares for the public sale. Along with Fritz, we learn that Phil, Kay's late husband, actually committed suicide. Fritz tells her not to sell any more family control. She's concerned about a clause in the contract with the bankers that says that if there is, quote, a disaster at the paper, they can cancel the contract. Fritz assures her that this is standard procedure, but she's clearly worried.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Just to do a bit of reality, the Post was indeed seeking public investment at the time set in the movie. Kay Graham had the long-term financial health of the company foremost in her mind, whereas Ben Bradlee had the reputation of the Post as a leading US news outlet in mind. So there was potential conflict there, as we've already seen. Fritz Beebe was a real person and a close friend and advisor to Kay Graham. Arthur Parsons, on the other hand, who's horribly slimy and just disparaging about her. He is fictional, and he's used to represent the condescending patriarchal attitudes of many of the men with whom Kay Graham would have to do business. Many by no means all.
And his comment saying that the Washington Post will always be a bit of a second-tier provincial paper, that's correct. At this time it wasn't the journalistic powerhouse that it would soon become after the Pentagon Papers and the publishing of the Watergate scandal, which was also the Post broke
and at that
with
stage,
Woodward and Bernstein.
They only had printing presses in Washington, whereas New York Times had outlets on the West Coast, in the North, and everything. The clause quoted by Fritz Beebe to Kay Graham about the investors being allowed to cancel a deal if a catastrophic event or disaster were to occur is spot on, but there's no specific definition of what that entails, and this will obviously raise its head later on. But they can only cancel within 7 days of signing.
Right.
And the example he gives, he says, look, if a truck runs over Ben Bradlee and then drives around the block, knocks over the offices, rams to the offices, comes around and hits Ben again, that could count as catastrophe.
Right.
So they sort of laugh about it, but you can see she's a bit worried.
So back to the movie, we see the young intern, given the $40 and told to go to New York, arrive at the New York Times. He asks the deliveryman where the newsroom is and heads to the elevators, having pinched a folder along the way so it looks like he actually has something to deliver. A group of men in deep conversation join the intern in the elevator, discussing how many pages to dedicate to some story that they've got. One suited man is reading a page from a file. The intern looks over his shoulder, but is challenged. He says he has to deliver something to a Mr. Maston. The suited man says he'll take it. Then we cut to a dinner party and we see Kay Graham and other senior Washington luminaries, including Robert McNamara. The men are discussing Henry Kissinger and geopolitics, at which point the host's wife says, "This is our cue, ladies." So the women all get up and leave because the serious discussions are coming, and that includes our Kay Graham. We see the patriarchal society in which she's trying to operate, but she leaves with the women with good grace. The men talk politics, the women gossip. One of them is saying to Kay, "I don't know how you do it, this day job thing." When Bob McNamara asks for a word with Kay, he tells her that an article that will be in the New York Times the next day, and it'll be about him, and it won't be flattering.
The next scene, we cut to Ben Bradlee arriving home. It's pretty late, it's dark, and we meet his wife Tony, played by Sarah Paulson, who's asleep on the sofa. Ben quietly turns off the TV, which had been left on, and then the phone rings, and it's Kay Graham. She asks if they got anywhere with Neil Sheehan, and he says no. She then tells him about her chat with McNamara, and we see Ben going straight back to the post offices, driving to the offices in the dead of night. The night crew are there, as is the young intern. He didn't manage to find Sheehan, but he did a mock-up of the Times next day's front page, which is what he'd seen over the guy's shoulder in the elevator. And the young lad sketches it, showing a large gap, front centre, containing nothing but the name Neil. Then morning breaks, we see papers being delivered to a newsstand, and Ben Bradlee and two of his team run up and buy 3 copies of the New York Times, and we see the headline, "Vietnam Archive, Pentagon Study Traces Decades of Growing US Involvement." So that is the first day of the Pentagon Papers story breaking.
Okay, and how did they do at that? Clearly there's a rivalry between the Post and the Times, and exactly how much the Post might have known about what is coming. They've laid a good, not trap, but they've good breadcrumbs for us here, saying that there's some gun reporter that's been away for months, something's up. So,
and they're probably very attuned to each other and what's going on, I guess.
Yeah, they would. They don't know. We don't know exactly what they did know, but it's likely that they got that tone right. They would have been suspicious and against their biggest competitor. Ben Bradlee and the senior Post staff were definitely aware that something was brewing. And Neil Sheehan, who is a real person and had been the Vietnam specialist reporter, so they correctly guessed has something to do with the war. It's also unclear from whom Bob McNamara received a warning that he was about to be unveiled in the papers as a man who said one thing in private and quite another in public. Today, I guess that wouldn't be all that surprising for a politician, but a lot of folk in these early days of mass media were less cynical, or maybe that should be informed.
Yeah, it's McNamara is a fascinating character, and he was indeed good friends with Kay Graham.
He was.
Hence him saying to her, "Look, this report's coming out, or this story's coming out. I'm not going to look very good in it."
And so he didn't want it published, according to the movie. But there is, isn't there? The truth of the matter is that maybe not immediately, but later on, definitely, he was happy that the papers got published.
Oh yeah, no, I don't think McNamara at any stage tried to stop it. I think he was. I don't think he would have weighed in. Well, he wasn't particularly good terms with Nixon's administration.
No.
He was so associated with the Democratic governments of Johnson and Kennedy, and of course Nixon was Republican and coming in. Anyway, back to the movie. We see Ben Bradlee and the Post journalist poring over the New York Times article, and in the background we hear President Nixon, more of the Nixon tape, speaking to Al Haig and Henry Kissinger, saying this is treasonable action. He calls the New York Times a number of nasty names and says it's a leak of highly classified material. A Post journalist reads that McNamara knew in '65 that the US couldn't win, and he says, hang on, that was 6 years ago. Ben Bradlee throws down the day's copy of their own paper, saying, well, at least we got the wedding. He asks if anyone has any leads, but only the lady from editorial has a suggestion about calling someone she knows who used to work with McNamara. Bradley's obviously angry at being scooped, and he's storming off when Ben... You seem to know how...
Bagdickian?
Bagdickian?
Yeah.
Ben, I think we say it very quickly, we'll get away with it. Bagdickian. Ben Bagdickian says, look, I may have something... And Ben Bradlee's like, look, come back when it's a bit less wishy-washy.
So how did the movie go there? It's true that the New York Times did take considerable risks in publishing the papers that they'd received from Daniel Ellsberg. They actually received 7,000 pages of material from which they started to publish extracts each day. Again, that portrayal of Nixon is overly negative. It was Henry Kissinger who urged, as we said, the president needs to try and stop these revelations because he was concerned what Foreign Affairs would do, and it would just generally destroy any credibility that the government's got.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, if Nixon was only concerned about his own reputation, he'd have probably been the one feeding them to the New York Times.
Ben Bradlee would have been angry that the Post had scooped him. He was ambitious and a good newsman, and he would have urged his team to get a copy as soon as possible of the New York Times with these salacious headlines.
So back to the movie, we see Kay Graham reading the papers with her adult daughter Lally, played by Alison Brie, who says it must be tough for a mother to read this because these are her people, JFK, Lyndon Johnson and McNamara, and we realise the circles in which the Grahams would socialise and operate. Although Kay says, oh, Jack and Lyndon were your father's friends. The doorbell rings and it's Ben Bradlee. He's clearly asking Kay to approach McNamara because he knows about their friendship, to see if McNamara has a copy of the study he'll give to her. She refuses, and Ben challenges her, saying, look, McNamara talks to you, so he's being your friend, so you'll go easy on him. And she says, no, I'm not going to tell you how to write about McNamara, but I'm also not going to ask McNamara to hand over a classified document. He gets quite angry and says she's putting a relationship with McNamara above the duty she owes to their readers. And she throws back to Ben that he used to dine with John F. Kennedy once a week at the White House. And he argues, he says, I never pulled any punches on the former president, but she's clearly scored a point. So
the short scene, but there's a lot in that.
Yeah.
Kay Graham was spot on when she threw Ben Bradlee's friendship with JFK back at him during their argument. Bradlee and JFK were close friends, and in a rather nice History by Hollywood universe twist, it was JFK who told Ben Bradlee at a party about the imminent swap of Soviet spy Rudolph Abel with US spy plane Gary Powers, something that gave Bradlee a scoop. Tom Hanks portrays Bradlee in The Post, but he also played Jim Donovan, the lawyer who brokered the deal in History by Hollywood's Episode 8, Bridge of Spies. Yeah. It is a small world.
It's a very small world, isn't it?
And JFK and Ben Bradlee were quite close friends, and his wife and their family used to spend a lot of time together. I think there's a suggestion that JFK may have had an affair with Bradlee's wife. Bradlee
later admitted, yes, he was too close to Kennedy. It probably did affect his objectivity. And he also admitted their friendship might not have been as close if Kennedy hadn't had an eye for his wife, Tony.
Yeah.
And some sources I've read claim that Tony Bradlee did, in fact, have an affair with John F. Kennedy, as most women he ever met did, apparently, from what you read. Either way, Bradlee would later wonder if he would later agree that he probably got a bit too close to Kennedy and his administration.
Back in the movie, we see Ben driving to work through some street protests about the contents of the New York Times article, people waving banners with Lyndon Johnson's image and liar written below. Kay Graham is seen arriving at a prestigious building. to be met by an aide who briefs her on a schedule. And the next day, it's the bankers' meeting. We're now at the Washington Post offices and we see Ben Bradlee get a call. He immediately says that he'll go back from outside and we see him leave. Meanwhile, a young woman comes into their offices with a package which she gives to a random reporter. He opens it and goes immediately to Ben Bradlee's office to be told that Ben Bradlee's busy. The reporter goes next door to Ben's deputy, who straight away goes into Bradlee's office. They start reading pages that were delivered to them and in the package, and they've clearly been given pages of the McNamara study. Ben Bradlee says, "We're back in the game." Meanwhile, Ben Bradlee is outside at a payphone, talking to a Harry Rowan, the boss of the Rand Corporation. Harry says that McNamara's study was a Department of Defence project, but Ben knows that copies were sent to Rand for safekeeping. Ben says that he thinks he knows who leaked the study, a man with courage, conviction and also an ego. He seeks agreement but gets silence, and "I got to go" from the other end, which is some sort of confirmation.
Yeah, the anonymously donated set of papers seems to be a fictional device, but not one with a clear purpose, because in all the accounts I've read, the first time the Post got their hands on actual copies or pages of the report was when Ben Bradlee, as we will shortly find out, managed to get some directly from Dan Ellsberg.
It is a bit confusing because they've got some of the Pentagon papers in this drop delivery at their offices.
Yeah, obviously a very small number,
but the exciting and sleuth-like work of Ben Bradlee gets them the motherload. So I'm not sure why they have that little diversion.
No, I can't see if it is a fictional device, I'm not sure what its purpose is. But it was Ben Bradlee who worked out it had to be Dan Ellsberg who'd leaked the papers and set about tracking him down. They knew each other, but not well. They had both worked together at the Rand Corporation when Ben Bradlee was doing a story. Ellsberg has since said, though, it was Bradlee's reputation for integrity and moral courage that persuaded him to hand over a further copy of the Vietnam report. And we've now got the real Ben Bradlee on this little part of his life.
He said, if I can get you the Pentagon papers, will you print them? Will the Washington Post print them? I said, yes. He said, is that a commitment? I said, I can't give you a commitment till I ask Bradlee. So I went over to back to the office. I said, Ben, what would you want to get a copy of the Pentagon papers? He said, I'd give my left one for that. And I said, well, if we get them, will we print them? He said, if we don't print them, there's going to be a new executive editor of the Washington Post the next day.
Next in the movie, we see Kay Graham arriving to dinner with Abe Rosenthal, played by Michael Stuhlbarg, and his wife Anne-Marie, played by Deborah Green. Rosenthal is Kay's equivalent at the New York Times, but although they're rivals, they're also clearly friends. There's a bit of banter backwards and forwards, and we cut to the Post's offices where reporters are trawling through the donated pages of the study, deciding when they can run it, only to have someone arrive and go, too late, New York Times already run. So the papers they've been given are obviously redundant.
The duplicates.
Yeah, duplicates, something given to New York Times. We then hear Nixon again having a phone conversation saying the New York Times are the enemy, we should prosecute them and go after whoever leaked the study.
Now at the New York Times offices, they receive a notice and their reaction is not good. The chief editor goes and interrupts the Rosenthal-Graham dinner to tell Abe the news that they're being served an injunction by the Attorney General and asked to stop publishing. Abe excuses himself from the table and we see Kay struggle not to react. She tells Mary Ann that she'll get the cheque, but then...
Anne-Marie.
What did I say? Mary Ann, beg your pardon. Anne-Marie, that she'll get the cheque. But then she asks the maitre d' for a telephone. Ben Bradlee is talking to Ben Bradlee, saying that he's sure the source is someone who he worked with at Rand. He's told to try and find the guy, we've not given any names yet, when Kay calls Ben and tells him that the Times are being served an injunction. Ben's reaction is that they're back in the game, but Kay says there is no game, and if they're all being shut down. Bradlee realises that they need an independent source if they're going to publish. So what's going on here?
Well, Nixon's government, however he's portrayed in the movie, certainly didn't waste any time or hang around. Once the decision was made to try and stop publication, things did move very fast. The Times were issued an injunction to cease and desist from publishing any more extracts until a judicial hearing could be assembled. Kay Graham was indeed having lunch with the Rosenthal's when the news arrived, and she did make this surreptitious call to Ben Bradlee to let him know what was happening. So the timeline, it almost looks too convenient. What are the odds that she was having dinner with this guy?
And what are the odds that they're even friends and on a social basis when they're clearly rivals?
But it's true.
And Ben Bradlee saying we're back in the ball game, that was his initial response, because he's saying, right, if they've got an injunction on the New York Times and we've got the duplicate bits of paper, then we're back in the game and we can start to publish.
Yeah.
But then
quickly realise, actually, you need your own
independent source.
She says in her memoir that as soon as I've read the part of her memoir that covers this period, she said as soon as they got the injunction, she was like, "Oh well, that's over."
Yeah, no one's going to publish now.
And then,
whereas an alternative view,
no, if we get our own source, but they couldn't. They didn't know where these anonymously donated papers came from, and if it came from the New York Times, then they couldn't use them because the
if they were identical,
would have covered them. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway,
back to the movie.
Back to the movie, and we see, of course, at the same time we've got the financial floating of the Washington Post company going on, and Kay Graham arrives at the bankers' meeting to be met by a mass of suits, whilst we cut away to Ben Bradlee calling people around from his desk, ringing lots of numbers, asking, "Oh, is Dan Ellsberg there? No, he doesn't work here anymore," or "No, you've got the wrong number," so he's crossing these numbers off, chasing down leads. Kay is welcomed to the stock exchange and makes a speech, managing to get through it okay, as we finally see Ben Bradlee find the company where Ellsberg works. He's told he's not there at the moment, but it's still definitely progress. Back at the stock exchange, Kay and Fritz are toasting a deal when back at the post offices, that's the Washington Post offices, not the post office, an intern hands Ben Bradlee a note with a number and says, "You're to call from a payphone."
The other workers are listening to a radio announcement that the New York Times has been ordered to cease publishing on the grounds of national security. We learn that the courts have never before ordered a newspaper to cease publication in the history of the US. Kay is clearly nervous by the story, but outside, Ben Bradlee calls his number. He asks for Dan and is given another phone number to call. He does so, showing a sharp reporter's memory, and suddenly he's talking to Dan Ellsberg. We see Bradlee arrive at a quiet motel and knock on the door. Ellsberg lets him in and shows him piles and piles of paper. He says that the report contained 47 volumes and it took months to copy every single bit of it. McNamara had wanted academics to study it and let the chips fall where they may, so McNamara historians will be looking at these
years later.
Ellsberg then says that it ran through presidency after presidency, all of them sending boys to die when they knew that they couldn't win. The study says that the US stayed in the fight 10% to support South Vietnam, 20% to fight communism, and 70% was to avoid humiliation of an American defeat. Ben says to Dan that they're going to go after him and he'll go to prison. Ellsberg replies that he'll go to prison if it stops the war. Bradlee agrees and promises that the Post will publish despite the injunction against the Times.
Yeah, and this is the clip we heard earlier where they've met and he's got the piles of paper, and obviously in reality Ben said, yeah, we really want the story, but I can't make the commitment to publish without speaking to Ben Bradlee. And as soon as he did, Ben Bradlee was like, yeah, you're right, we're going to publish. So the other reality bit, the financial floating of the Washington Post company, would have been a tense period for Kay Graham. And again, we come back to the earlier mention of the catastrophic event clause. The cloak and dagger way in which Bradlee finds and then contacts Daniel Ellsberg would have pretty much, been as seen. Something borne out much later during Ellsberg's court case, more of which later. And the discussion that reveals the unique nature of the US government trying to shut down a newspaper's right to report is correct. Never before in the history of the US had an administration attempted to stop pre-publication, i.e. stop a publication before it even happens. In Britain, it happens all the time.
Yeah,
we have D-notices.
That's what it is, D-notices.
There's been a couple of famous high-profile ones where they've tried and failed. One was a memoir of an MI6 agent in the 80s, this would have been, and I can't remember, it was quite famous at the time, I can't remember what it was about. But the people said afterwards the main reason for the attempted D-notice wasn't to stop him giving away any secrets, it was to show how incompetent MI6 were. But no, I can't remember what that was called.
Anyway, back to the movie.
Yeah.
We see Bagdikian call Bradlee and says he'll need 2 first-class business seats on the morning flight. Bradlee tells his wife that they'll be having a heap of people coming over, and then he dashes out. He arrives at Kay's house and let her know that they've got a copy of the study coming on its way. She is scared, both about possible prosecutions and the banker's getting nervous. Kay is then hosting a party, and looking out from her office to the patio, Ben sees Bob McNamara outside and gives her a speech about the conflict of friendship and duty. He asks her rhetorically what she's going to do when he gets his hands on the study.
So, can I ask you a hypothetical question?
Oh, dear, I don't like hypothetical questions.
Well, I don't think you're going to like the real one either.
Do you have the papers?
Not yet.
Oh, gosh, because you know the position that would put me in. You know, we have language in the prospectus.
Yeah, I know that the
Which-
bankers can change their mind. And I know what is at stake. You know, the only couple I knew that both Kennedy and LBJ wanted to socialize with was you and your husband, and you owned the damn paper. Well, that's the way things worked. Politicians and the press, they trusted each other so they could go to the same dinner party and drink cocktails and tell jokes while there was a war raging in Vietnam.
I don't know what we're talking about. I'm not protecting Lyndon.
No, you got his former Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, the man who commissioned this study. He's one of about a dozen party guests out on your
I'm not protecting any of them.
patio.
I'm protecting the paper.
So again, we see Ben Bradlee sort of pushing Kay Graham. Of, you know, look, just because you're close to these people, you can't protect them, and you can imagine the pressure she is feeling under. But at the same time, I don't think he's doing it in the way Arthur Parsons' sort of dismissive, misogynist way.
Yeah.
I just think he's like trying to push a boss to let him do what he feels is the right thing to do as an editor.
Let the truth speak, despite who it might impact.
Back with the movie, we see Ben Bagdikian on his flight with a big box beside him. It's quite funny when he's strapping it in, isn't he? And a stewardess says to him, "Oh, that must be important." He went, "Yeah, it's just full of government secrets." And suppose he genuinely did say that, but also, and it's just to jump aside to a little bit of reality on it, that actually there was a guy that they just recruited who knew Ben, and he was just about to start work at the Post, came across and went, "Oh, you know," hoping to sit next to him, and Ben Bagdikian can't talk to him about it. And this guy went, "Wow, you've got it then." So he'd obviously heard what he'd gone for. Ben Bagdikian's thinking, "Shut up, please." So he has his flight. He arrives back at Ben Bradlee's house with a bunch of the Post reporters and editors already there, or arriving at the same time. Ben Bradlee's daughter's outside selling homemade lemonade, and Bagdikian carries his 2 boxes into the house. He tells them it's not the full report, but it's over 4,000 pages. And then they realise that the pages aren't numbered, and they've got all these top secret caveats have been chopped off.
Jumbled up too.
But they've lost the page numbers as well. And they also realise with a shock they've only got hours to publication time if they're going to make the next day's paper. But Bradlee gives them a little pep talk, and we've got another clip.
It's not the full report, but it's over 4,000 pages of it.
Huh. Are these in order?
I don't think so.
There are no page numbers.
Yeah, that's where the top secret stamps were. My source had to cut them off.
We're supposed to retire on Friday.
Ben, how are we supposed to comb through 4,000 pages?
They're
of
not even
material?
loosely
The
organized?
Times had 3 months. There's no way we can possibly
He's
get
right.
this done.
We got less than 8 hours.
We could shoot for City, then we'd have 10.
Hey, for the last 6 years we've been playing catch-up, and now thanks to the President of the United States, who, by the way, has taken a shit all over the First Amendment, we have the goods. We don't have any competition. There's dozens of stories in here. The Times has barely scratched the surface. We have 10 hours till the deadline, so we dig in.
Back to the movie.
We see Ben Bradlee's house again, the legal counsellor Roger Clark, and he's joined by another lawyer, Tony Essay, played by Zach Woods. They warn that Ben could be violating the Espionage Act if he publishes, but he argues that only if they damage the United States. The lawyers argue that a federal judge in New York thinks that sensitive material could be included. They ask Bradlee if he is sure that not one item can endanger American lives or give away any military plans or secrets. He says yes, he's sure that nothing like that will get out. They ask if he's sure, really sure, and he says, no, of course not. That's why I called you guys. Back at McNamara's house, he's saying to Kay that the study was commissioned for academics to try and learn from it for the future, after the war was ended. But they're still in the middle of it now, and the papers can't be objective. And now we've got a little clip of this dialogue.
My dear friend, my feelings about that and about you can't be part of this decision to publish or not. I'm here asking your advice, Bob, not your permission.
Well, then, as one of your most trusted advisors and someone who knows how much you care about this company, I'm worried, okay? You know, I worked in Washington for 10 years. I've seen these people up close. Bobby and Lyndon, they were tough customers, but Nixon is different. He's got some real bad people around him, and if you publish, he'll get the very worst of them. The Colsons and the Ehrlichmans, and he'll crush you.
I know, he's just awful, but
Nixon's a son of a bitch. He hates you. He hates Ben. He's wanted to ruin the paper for years, and you will not get a second chance, Kay. The Richard Nixon I know will muster the full power of the presidency, and if there's a way to destroy your paper, by God, he'll find it.
Reality check. Ben Bradlee's since talked extensively about the feeling of being painted into a corner. The lawyers kept repeating the injunctions against the New York Times meant the Post could not publish without risking breaking the law and knowingly breaking it. Senior journalists threatened to resign if the paper refused to publish, and Bradlee's own opinion was that to have the report and not publish it would be akin to holding a rope and not throwing it to a drowning man. It later emerged that the Times legal team, Lord, Day and Lord, who'd been with the Times for about 100 years, was so strongly against them publishing that they refused to handle the case, and the Times published it anyway.
Wow. Just a point of interest, Robert McNamara was having dinner with James Scotty Reston, a senior New York Times man, around about this time, and while regretting the timing of the Times' series on the Vietnam report, he encouraged the Times to push on and publish when they were asked to desist. McNamara even urged them to change the wording of their defiant response to the Attorney General's demand that they desist from further publication from, "We respectfully decline, but will abide by the decision of the courts," to the final decision of the courts, singular. If this had not been changed, they would have been obliged to willingly stop publication on the order of any court.
Yeah, and that's quite a key point, isn't it?
Yeah, isn't it? One
and that
letter.
Came from Bob McNamara.
Yeah, good on him. So he was well behind publishing by this time.
Back to the movie, and with Ben Bradlee and the lawyers, Ben's telling them that with what the Post pays them, they shouldn't lose a case were one to be brought against them. Then Fritz Beebe arrives and warns that Ben could be endangering the paper's very existence. He says if the government go after them, it could endanger the stock market float and their TV stations, because convicted felons are not allowed to own TV stations. Ben says, I don't care about TV stations, and Fritz tells him, well, you should, because they make a heck of a lot more money than your paper does. He says that if the government win a conviction against the Post, it will effectively cease to exist. And in a quite nice reporter's play on words, Ben retorts that in a world where the government can dictate what is and isn't published, the Post has effectively ceased to exist already.
Roger Clark, the young lawyer, suggests holding off publication for a few days and advising the Attorney General what they have and what they intend to do. Ben Bradlee is dumbstruck by this idea, and Ben Badikian says that apart from landing the Hindenburg in a lightning storm, it's the shittiest idea he's ever heard. Clark is abashed.
Yeah, the reality, Ben Bradlee credits Ben Badikian with saying during this discussion the only way to protect the right to publish is to publish, and that this statement summed up how everyone except the lawyers felt about the situation. The lawyers' position was that the Post was in a more precarious position than the Times had been, because now they knew an injunction had been served against the Times, even a temporary holding one. For them to go ahead and publish could see the Post held in contempt of court.
There was the ongoing negotiations about the stock exchange flotation at this time. Although the contract had been signed, the underwriters had a week after signature to buy all the stock and resell it to the committed investors. But the catastrophe clause could bite them, and the Pentagon Papers issue was being argued over right during that critical week.
Yeah, so I mean, it really is all these different threads coming together. So back at the movie, Kay Graham's hosting a retirement party for Harry Gladstein, one of the Post stalwart executives. She's told that things are getting hot over at Ben's house, and she's surprised to learn that Ben Bradlee and Fritz Beebe are on opposing sides. The arguments continue, but Ben is clearly planning to publish anyway. He finds Fritz on a phone, who admits he's calling Kay Graham. So Ben picks up another handset to listen in, and he tells Fritz that he's doing so. Kay is out in her garden making a speech about Harry, the retiring executive, when she's interrupted by a maid who insists that she's needed on the phone. So she excuses herself, but Harry's very understanding, making a joke about, well, you're paying the overtime.
Arriving in her office, she sees Arthur Parsons on the phone talking to Ben Bradlee. She tells Parsons that there's an extension in the living room if he wants to listen, but demands to have the phone herself. So there are 5 people in a cross-argument. Ben and Phil Galen on the one side of publishing, Parsons and Beebe against. Kay hears that several senior reporters have said they'll resign if they don't publish, and Ben says that their reputation will go down the pan if they don't publish. Parsons urges caution, then Kay asks Fritz for his opinion. He sounds hesitant. Fritz says there are arguments on both sides, but I guess I wouldn't publish. She hesitates again, then says, let's go, let's publish. Ben Bradlee is jubilant, and the reporters redouble their efforts to sort out the papers and write up something coherent. The 2 lawyers look shocked and leave the room together. Then Ben Bradlee leaves with a written article and rushes it to the post offices, where a night editor starts to work on it. Arthur Parsons is still trying to get Kay Graham to change her mind, saying that there's still time. He says that he's spoken to a couple of bankers and he thinks that some of their investors may pull out. He's persistent, but Kay gives him no answer. Back at the Post, the article goes to the presses for the typeset to be readied. Roger Clark has arrived at the offices and asks Ben Bradlee for his source. Clark points out that if the source was the same as the New York Times' source, the Post was aware of it, the injunction against the Times would also apply to the Post. Bradlee admits that their respective sources are likely the same.
Yeah, quite a bit to wrap up there. So on reality, Kay Graham says that Fritz Beebe was very sensitive to editorial integrity, but as a lawyer he was concerned about the prospectus paragraph where the Post promised to be a newspaper dedicated to the community and national welfare, and that they could be seen in breach of that if the government could show that publishing the papers was against the national interest. Ben Bradlee and his team of reporters used the same statement to support publication, saying it is in the national welfare that we publish these. So Beebe was worried about prosecution under the Espionage Act and was leaning towards the lawyer's viewpoint. Ben Bradlee actually called a lawyer friend in Chicago, a guy called Ed Williams that Kay Graham knew as well, and ran by him as objectively as possible what was going on and asked his legal advice, and his answer was, well, Benji, you've got to go with it. So, you know, there's obviously even legal minds are kind of, well,
divided.
Yeah.
Clearly. Jean Patterson, another Post senior staffer, stopped by Ben's house and arriving at Kay Graham's house for the retirement party, warned her that she was likely to have to call it one way or the other. And that phone call with multiple people on the line, the 5 people portrayed in the movie, is attested to by Kay Graham's own memoir. In it, she says that Fritz did indeed give her the answer, I guess I wouldn't. And she also says that she's asked for more time, asking why there was so much urgency. Ben Bradlee replied that it was all about momentum, not letting a day get away now that they had the story, and stressed that other journalists would want to know what the Post had so that they could in turn report on it. They'd all be watching to see what they did with their information. She says that what persuaded her to publish, in the face of what Fritz Beebe had said, had more to do with the way he said it. It wasn't an unequivocal statement, and Kay Graham believed it left the door open, and she took the decision bravely to publish.
Yeah. Back at the Bradleys' house, he's talking with Tony, his wife, and says we're publishing. She says she admires Kay Graham's courage as she has so much to lose. And Ben sort of good-naturedly says, well, I've got a lot to lose as well. And she scoffs and says, well, okay, you're very brave too. But then she just says a few words to him about Kay Graham and the situation that she finds herself in.
But Kay's in a position she never thought she'd be in. Position I'm sure plenty of people don't think she should have. And when you're told time and time again that you're not good enough, that your opinion doesn't matter as much, when they don't just look past you, when to them you're not even there, when that's been your reality for so long, it's hard not to let yourself think it's true. So to make this decision, to risk her fortune and the company that's been her entire life, well, I think that's brave.
So next we see Kay putting her granddaughter to bed when her own daughter comes into the child's bedroom. Kay asks her to read some notes that Kay has made for a speech on the occasion of her husband's funeral. about holding on to the paper and securing its future. She's clearly still struggling with her decision. She remembers suddenly being responsible for running the Post at 45 years old and never having held a job in her life. She's interrupted by a maid. Ben Bradlee is in her hallway and tells her about the problem, about the common source for their story with the New York Times and how that might stymie them publishing. He makes sure she understands how much is at stake. Both he and Kay Graham could go to jail if they're convicted. The typeset is still being prepared, ready for publication, as the legal team and other senior Post officials arrive at Kay's house.
Okay, reality on that. I mean, Tony Bradley, back to the clip we heard, makes a really good point about Kay Graham and the path she was blazing in the publishing world. Yes, she was a member of Washington's elite. She almost certainly never had to worry about personal money. And as she says to her daughter, she'd never worked a day in her life before taking over at the Post. But she did clearly take her responsibilities very seriously and was willing to follow her instincts whilst also being open to advice, whilst, hearing advice on caution from the legal team, but not necessarily always going down that route.
Yeah.
The scenes over the argument on whether to reverse the decision to publish take up a lot more space in the movie, and they're doing the accounts of those who were there. It's almost like it did go on for several hours, the whole thing, but it's, it was kind of part of the same discussion they'd had earlier.
Yeah, we've said in the past that some of the mistakes that the filmmakers make, deliberate mistakes, are to conflate 5 or 10 years into one summer. But this is sort of the reverse, to build the tension. They're stretching out the will we, won't we, will we, won't we, for days and days.
Then Roger Clark says to Bagdickian, if it's the same source and you know it's the same source, then the injunction stands against you as well, and then so it's almost like a new development.
But they knew pretty much all of this the whole time and had a slight argument amongst themselves and decided to publish a fair bit quicker than the movie would portray.
So back to the movie. At the Post printing press, a worker calls out that if they don't start the run, they're going to miss the carrier's deadline. At the Kay's house, Parsons and Beebe are arguing that the investors' clause about catastrophe, whether or not that could be used in the event of a conviction or indictment. Kay's been pecked at for most of the men present. She stands and talks about the Post prospectus that also talked about securing the freedom of the press. Turning to Ben Bradlee, she asks for his assurance that what they intend to publish won't endanger any of their soldiers served in Vietnam. And as we found out earlier, her son has served a tour in Vietnam, so she's, as a parent of someone who'd served there, she's very conscious of that. Parsons interrupts her to basically just say, you can't let him get away with this. To be told, I'm talking to Mr. Bradley. But he still doesn't give up, this horrible, slimy Parsons character, who we should remind you is fictitious. He looks horrified and turning to Fritz Beebe says, she can't do that. But Fritz Beebe says, yes, she can. It's entirely her decision. And then Parsons is still heckling her, accusing Ben Bradlee of leading her to folly. And she reminds him it's her company, and anyone who thinks otherwise probably shouldn't be on her board, which finally shuts him up.
Ben Bradlee then assures her that what they're publishing won't endanger any lives. She says that her decision stands and sweeps from the room. Fritz Beebe, despite his earlier caution, looks impressed as Ben calls the newsroom and tells them to start the printing run. So let's just check that bit.
Yeah, I mean, the issue about using common source did raise its head, but this is where Fritz Beebe showed his mettle and actually urged Kay Graham to push on now the decision had been made.
So he turned around.
Yeah, he said it doesn't make it any worse than we decided earlier. The fictional character Parsons again is used to represent a number of people who urged against publications, at least until the Times was cleared or not, whereas of course Ben Bradlee's looking at, well, whilst they can't publish, we've got the playing field to ourselves. And they both attest that once the decision was made, then confirmed, the legal team of Clark and Essay actually swung into full support and started preparing their case in expectation of having to argue it in court.
Then back in the movie, we see the sheets running on the conveyor belts and the headline on the front page, with both their own headlines about the Vietnam conflict and also giving support to the New York Times. Stacks of newspapers are loaded on trucks which head out. Bradlee is told that the Assistant Attorney General is on the line. He's told that the government believes that the Post are in breach of the Espionage Act and that they respectfully request the Post stop. Ben replies that he must respectfully refuse. The official thanks him for his time and hangs up. Fritz, now fully on board, tells Ben and Kay that they'll go to court that day to seek a legal ruling allowing them to continue to publish, and they'll be up with the same argument against the Supreme Court within a week. We see a closed hearing with a government official arguing that other countries won't talk to the US in confidence if secrets like this could be leaked. Another government rep says that without secrecy, the president can't govern. Fritz is on the phone, hearing that some of the Post investors are rattled and considering withdrawing. As he argues, Kay is shown the New York Times front page, which says courts differ on the Vietnam papers. Times series still held up. Washington Post escapes a ban, it says. In court, a judge asked Roger Clark, representing the Post, if they would have published plans of D-Day before the invasion. Clark argues that it's a very different case, as what the Post are publishing are historical documents, not future plans. So more legal shenanigans.
Yeah, reality is Kay Graham was actually in Ben Bradlee's office when William Rehnquist, then the Assistant Attorney General, came through on the phone, pretty much as shown in the movie, both very polite, both very direct. The initial legal decision was made on June 18th by Judge Gessel, who refused to grant an order restraining the Post. However, the Court of Appeals, to whom the government immediately turned, reversed this decision, but accepted that the newspaper run was already underway, and therefore the injunction wouldn't come into force until the following day. So the run that night for the next day morning's paper would go ahead.
Proceed, yeah.
Gessel was then ordered by the Court of Appeal to hold another more detailed hearing, which gave him time to study the case. He asked the Justice Department to show him the 10 most damaging items in the report, and he would make a judgment on that list alone. Justice Department officials then tried to tell him that none of the defendants from the Post could be allowed to attend the hearings, it had to be held in secret, and Judge Gessel said, well, if you push for that, I'm going to dismiss the entire proceeding, because I've never heard anything so ridiculous.
So the people accused of a crime weren't allowed to be in the courtroom to hear the charges.
But they were. But the Justice Department was trying to say they shouldn't.
Yeah, ridiculous.
And he said, well, if you insist on that, then there is no case to answer.
Yeah, Gessel's hearings make for surreal reading. At one point, he tells the Justice Department to dismiss a witness, a man in civilian clothing who claimed to speak for a general, and fetch the general in question himself. Asked if the offending passage did indeed reveal US war plans, the military man answered that if people thought these were the US war plans, quote, I sure hope so, because these are entirely out of date, unquote. Gessel again refused to issue an injunction against the Post, but the DC Appeal Court continued the temporary restraining order and ordered a hearing before the 9-court appellate judge. This court again...
Nine-judge appellate court.
9-judge appellate court, thank you. This court again upheld the Post's right to publish, but the restraint remained in force, allowing the government further time to appeal. Wow.
Yeah, it's getting quite convoluted. That's the reality, which they don't go into in great detail in the movie because it is unnecessary. But
even in reality, at this time, we're not yet at the Supreme Court. We're working our way up through the court system to get there, right?
What it does show as well is not the value, the essential nature of having an independent judiciary.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the strengths of the American system where the Supreme Court, you're appointed for life.
Yeah.
Yes, they can appoint people to lean who you think might lean your way, but people can change, and they might be there for 30 or 40 years. But you can't, they can't be deselected because they annoy a government.
And there are recent examples of that. The Supreme Court Justice Kennedy, he voted in favour of Obamacare a couple of years back when everybody thought as a conservative he would definitely knock it on the head. So yeah, you're right, people do change over such a long period of time.
Back at the movie, at the post offices, Ben Bradlee is with Ben Bradlee, hands him a small paper bag, hands him a paper bag and says, I always wanted to be part of a small rebellion. And at this stage we're not sure what's in the bag. Start watching a TV interview with Daniel Ellsberg, who's talking about the revelations and his justification for leaking the Pentagon Papers, because by now his name's out there. And the accusation that revealing them was tantamount to treason was, in Ellsberg's opinion, close to the president saying, I am the state. And that, he says, he could not accept.
Ben Bradlee, we see him entering Graham's office, Kay Graham's office, sweeps the coffee table clear, opens the bag that Bagdikian had given him, and throws down newspaper after newspaper. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, quote McNamara's study, the Christian Science Monitor do the same, as do the Boston Globe, the Tallahassee Democrat, and so on and so on. Many other papers, including the Philadelphia Inquirer. Ben says to Kay that whatever happens, they are no longer a little local paper.
No, and the reality on that is that Ellsberg had by now passed copies of the report to at least 10 other newspapers, all of whom published excerpts from it. So although Ben Bradlee and every other editor in the land wanted to scoop the opposition within the industry, he and all the others had recognised by now that they were actually in a fight for the industry itself, and he was jubilant at the solidarity shown. The mention of the Philadelphia Inquirer, not to be confused with the National Enquirer, which is a completely different kettle of fish, has the Philadelphia Inquirer has a long and honourable history of producing reporters who dig away at stories until they break them open, and often winning such industry awards as the Pulitzer Prize as a result, either at the Inquirer or later. And of course the Washington Post's own Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, the reporters who broke the Watergate story, both cut their journalistic teeth at the Inquirer.
I didn't know that about the reputation of the Inquirer.
Yeah, no, it's I don't know if it still has, but certainly it did have an incredible reputation for
investigative journalism.
Investigative journalism with integrity, but also with tenacity.
Back to the movie. Arriving at court, we see Kay join a long queue, but a young lady approaches her and offers her to lead her through a side entrance. Talking, the young lady reveals that she works for the Solicitor General's office, to which Kay laughs that, oh, so you're on the other team, the government in other words. The young woman says she probably shouldn't say this, but her brother is still over in Vietnam and she hopes Mrs. Graham wins. Kay is flanked by Ben and Fritz as Abe Rosenthal sits next door and comments it's nice to be on the same team for once. The court assembles, but we don't see any of the proceedings. The teams leave the court, and as Kay leaves, a large group of young women, many of them hippie-looking, open a path for her, looking on approvingly.
At the post offices, a phone rings and the court's decision is being called in. It's 6-3 in favour of the Post and the Times. There's cheers, applause and backslapping ensues. Ben runs to Kay's office as the lady reporting on the phone gives Justice Black's opinion, which is all about the Founding Fathers' establishment of a free press being to serve the people, not the government. Kay is talking to Ben at the presses and tells him that they have a duty to just keep on reporting, despite news that the Justice Department is still considering charges against them. She asks Ben if he's not worried, and he says, "No, I'm not worried, that's your job," which is quite a nice little bounce back.
The film's pretty much over, it's wrapping up well and truly now, so what about the accuracy of that?
The Solicitor General Erwin Griswold said later that when he was told to bring this case, he continually urged the Nixon administration against continuing, saying, "You have got no grounds to force the papers to desist." However, he was ignored and the case went to the Supreme Court. Griswold was given 24 hours to prepare the case for the government. Arriving at court, he had 3 copies of his brief, one for him to use and one for the counsels of the Times and the Post. And a guard at the court said to Griswold, "You can't give copies to the newspaper's lawyers. That's treason. They're the enemy."
I don't know what the guard's doing, getting involved.
Exactly.
The argument put forward by the government that publication endangered American lives and gave away state secrets was clearly an exaggeration. However, the principle about frequent governmental reliance on secrecy when dealing with foreign powers, both friendly and hostile, was one pushed hard by the Solicitor General's team and clearly gained traction with a few of the judges. However, the result of the 6-3 in favour of allowing the papers to publish did come through reasonably quickly, and some accounts suggest that at least one of the judges voting against it only did so once he knew that the government were going to lose, just to bring the score a little bit closer together.
Yeah, I can't remember his name, but I read one, and at least one of them definitely dropped. People were saying, "Well, why did you think the government were right?" And he said, obviously it's public the way each one votes.
Yes.
And the way he answered the question was so guarded, they thought, "No, you've just done it so it's not an absolute whitewash."
Yeah,
just to give a little bit of balance. But, once 6 people have said, "Well, we're saying continue," then it's safe to... And maybe they all sat down and said, "Look, let's face it, we all know they've got no grounds. We're going to go ahead and publish."
Let's let the government save a little bit of face.
Yeah, let's not make it 9-0.
But it did happen quickly, and I know that Supreme Court decisions like this can take months and months and months. So there must have been some impetus here for them to act quickly, obviously.
It did surprise everybody. I think the Solicitor General had been on holiday in Florida, or it might have been Mexico or somewhere, or the Florida Keys. And when the news first broke, he said, "Oh, I'll be having a big case in the autumn." And then he got a phone call saying, "No, you need to get back now."
24 hours.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was him.
So, to wrap up the movie, we cut back to the film and we hear another Nixon phone call.
In fact, this is the call that we played earlier.
Yeah, that's right.
This is the one saying no Washington Post. But what they don't play in the movie, or I didn't hear if they did, was where he threatens to fire the guy to whom he's giving the order.
No, I don't remember that in the movie.
No. That's the bit on the clip, yeah.
Fantastic.
Horrible.
And roll credits as the...
Well, as the phone call continues, we
we
see the security guard, don't we?
That's right. They tell us that the security guards discovered evidence of a break-in at the Democratic National Committee offices. The offices are in the Watergate Hotel building, and the movie ends.
Yeah, and as we said, the real Nixon vendetta against the newspapers, and in particular the Washington Post, was still to come a year later. But that's a story for another day. Now we're just going to play a clip here of the real Kay Graham on the decision to publish. And what it does, it's for us, it's a little bit of a longer clip. It's nearly a couple of minutes long. But the first thing it will give you is a judgment on just how accurately Meryl Streep recreated the timbre of her voice and her inflections. But also, she kind of validates lots and lots of little details of the movie just by this one little speech. So here we go.
The Pentagon Papers had been given by Daniel Ellsberg to the New York Times, and the New York Times had published them after thinking about it for 3 months. And then they had been enjoined by the administration and taken to court and stopped on the theory that the government could use prior restraint against a newspaper. And so they had been stopped, and in the meantime, just as they were stopped, the Pentagon Papers were delivered to us. And so we were writing the story of the Pentagon Papers all day long, but we just had one day. And the editors and the reporters really thought we had to resume where the Times left off, and that momentum was very important to keep up. And I was giving a farewell cocktail party for an executive who was leaving. So I was at my house, and they were at Ben Bradlee's house. And with them was my colleague, who was chairman of our board, Fritz Beebe, who was a lawyer. And so it never occurred to me that anything would happen to us, and I thought we were going to go ahead and publish. And we were in the very act of going public. Our stock had gone to the brokers on Wall Street, but had not been sold. And so I was called to the phone when we were right on deadline, because what had in fact happened was that the editors and the publishers said, of course we're going to publish. And the lawyer said, really you can't, because this is really double jeopardy in the face of the Times being enjoined. And so I got on the phone and I said, why can't we think it over? The Times thought it over for 3 months. And the editors and the reporters convinced me that momentum and the idea that you couldn't enjoin the press, you couldn't stop the press in advance of publication was very important, and that they had to print that night. And so I had to make up my mind on the phone, and I said to Fritz Beebe at the other house, what would you do? Because I got along with him wonderfully. I loved his judgment. And he said, I guess I would not, because I can understand that. We were going public. It was very risky, and the administration was threatening us. And I really was convinced by the editors and the reporters that they were right, and that we really had to go ahead. And so I really gulped, and I really was not what your heroic leader is. I just said, oh, go ahead.
So there we go. That was Kay Graham on all those decisions. By the way, if anyone would like to read the Pentagon Papers report, or to give it its official title, Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force, it was released in its unredacted entirety in 2011, and we will have a link to the National Archive Office's page for it, from where you can download it in PDF form. It's very long, but for anyone interested in that period of history, it would be good to read. And Ben Bradlee actually has said that when he read it, was it Ben Bradlee? Or no, Ben Bradlee or Daniel Ellsberg, the copies that they got snaked to them by Daniel Ellsberg were heavily redacted compared to what's available now. So actually you are going to read the unadulterated truth.
Which they didn't have at the time.
They had,
they had scandals,
and
oh, I see. So it wasn't.
But there were still bits
enough
that
for them
were,
to piece it together. Ben Bradlee would go on to lead the Post for many more years. He died in 2014 at the ripe old age of 93. And if you've seen the Ben Bradlee documentary, The Newspaperman, in that he seems to be chain smoking all the time, so he did well to last to 93. Ben Bradlee was another who lived a full long life, dying in 2016 at the age of 96. Katherine Graham died in 2001, aged 84.
Now, Daniel Ellsberg, he was charged under the Espionage Act, along with a accomplice who's seen in the film. He's the guy helping him, who had Rosso. who had a much bigger part than he's given in the film, but he was still the junior partner. Ellsberg was looking at a 100-year plus sentence, but the case was still... in fact, and that's right, when he went in, his argument was that to say it was treason was purely to defend the government's reputation, and actually it was treasonous not to reveal it to the papers. The judge forbade him from making that statement.
Yeah, saying
he wasn't allowed to justify why he'd done it. So you start thinking, wow.
He's in trouble.
Yeah, didn't it? You found a quote, didn't his lawyer said, "I've never been to a case where the defendant isn't even allowed to explain why he did what he did." And the judge said, "Well, you're at one now."
Yeah, so things started off very badly for him in the trial, didn't they?
And this was in 1973 by the time it came to court. But then the judge found out that the FBI had broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist looking for information on him. They'd illegally wiretapped him, and they'd failed to share any of this information with the defence, which is legally required. So the judge dismissed the case.
Yeah, so Ellsberg got off, didn't spend.
And the double jeopardy laws means he can't be done for it again. And Daniel Ellsberg is still with us. He's still alive, and he's written several books.
90-something?
Yeah.
Years old. In 2013, the Graham family sold the Washington Post to Nash Holdings, Inc., owned by the Bezos family of Amazon fame, Jeff Bezos. So the Washington Post, which was at the time being threatened profitability and being shut down like most newspapers, traditional newspapers.
Print media,
yeah. It got a new lease of life and an injection of funds from the Amazon empire. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for objective reporting is yet to be determined. But several of our American and non-American acquaintances have expressed concern over the Post's independence and integrity in recent years. Their reputation has definitely gone up since the election of Trump. They've won Pulitzer Prizes since then, I believe, and I'm a big fan of the current version of the Washington Post. I visit it every single day for their reporting, mainly about American politics.
Right.
So it seems to, despite some significant blips along the way, I think maybe the Amazon injection was a good thing in the long run. The time will tell.
Certainly, there is an argument that an individual who is incredibly rich, and this was, I suppose, part of Trump's argument, is kind of incorruptible. Doesn't need to count out to everyone, but then you think, well, how did you become incredibly rich? Yeah. Anyway, we should wrap up. Yeah.
Entertainment? What do you give it out of 10?
When I first watched it, I watched it through a few weeks ago without trying to take notes or anything, just to enjoy it. And I think I said to you, it was fascinating,
interesting,
but not necessarily gripping.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's well done. It's well executed, well acted, and
it's great performance.
Masterful. But there's nothing edge of the seat. Nothing really grips you. No huge twists and surprises.
It ain't no Schindler's List.
It ain't no Schindler's List. Yeah, even though there's no surprises there for us either. But you're right.
And yet I find myself leaning more towards an 8 than a 7
for entertainment.
Yeah, I did enjoy it. I did enjoy it.
Yeah.
If you're on a plane or you notice it's on TV, definitely
give
watch
it a go.
Maybe you would.
Okay, I agree then.
Pay to stream it, I'm not sure.
And history was pretty good. There was one or two confected characters, but I think they got the history pretty well right. What about you?
I'd say 8 at least.
I'd give it an 8.
Yeah.
I'd give it an 8. So that's 2 8s from both
16,
of us.
so 32.
Yeah, that's a good
40.
strong
Not bad
score.
at all. Like our scores really matter in the entertainment
That's
world.
right. Like anyone takes notice.
Okay, so next time out will be Darkest Hour, starring Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill, and that will be me, Martin,
without
Andrew, and possibly with someone else. So that's something to look forward to.
You can't confirm that at this stage.
I'm hoping I will be able to confirm it when they hear the next episode, our dear listeners, because, well, it will definitely be confirmed one way or the other.
Yes, that's true.
Our guest will be on it, but he is a very strong expert on Churchill and that period of history.
Fingers crossed.
Yes.
So on that note, thanks for your time, and Martin will see you in a couple of weeks, and I'll catch up with you a bit after that.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Cheers.
The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.